When I accepted the job as a nighttime janitor at St. Mary's Memorial, I thought I had struck gold. The hospital had been shut down for nearly 2 decades, left to gather dust in a forgotten corner of town. It wasn't exactly a dream gig, but it was quiet, isolated, and offered a paycheck that I desperately needed. After losing my previous job and with bills piling up, this seemed like an easy way to scrape by. The building had that typical abandoned aura. Faded paint peeling off the walls, windows grimy with decades of neglect, and a faint, musty odor that clung to everything. During my walkthrough with Mr. Grayson, the night supervisor, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. It wasn't just the silence or the dim lighting. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "This place has its quirks," Grayson said as he led me down a long corridor, his flashlight flickering occasionally. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was holding something back. "You'll need to follow some specific protocols while you're here. Safety, you know." He handed me a small laminated card with a list of rules. The rules were odd, to say the least. 1. Never enter the surgery room after 10 p.m. 2. If you hear someone calling your name, do not respond. 3. At exactly 3 a.m., make sure all the lights on the second floor are turned off. 4. Do not, under any circumstances, look directly into the mirrors in room 313. 5. If you hear knocking, ignore it. I stared at the card, unsure if this was some kind of hazing ritual. "Is this serious?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Grayson didn't smile. "Deadly serious. People who don't follow the rules. Well, let's just say it's better if you stick to them." That night, as I set out to clean the halls and dust off forgotten equipment, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Grayson's words had left me with. Still, the first shift went by without much incident. I swept floors, wiped down counters, and even peeked into the surgery room, just for a second. It was empty, of course, with an old gurney in the center and a flickering overhead light that buzzed faintly. Nothing to worry about. By the end of my shift, I was already feeling more confident. A paycheck's a paycheck, I muttered to myself as I locked up the janitor's closet and headed out. But as I stepped into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all along. My second night at St. Mary's started like any other. I arrived at 10 p.m. sharp, signed in at the security desk, and grabbed my supply cart from the janitor's closet. The laminated card with the rules was tucked into my back pocket. Not because I believed in them, but because Grayson had been insistent. I figured it wouldn't hurt to humor him. The hospital felt different that night. The silence wasn't just silence. It was oppressive, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Every step I took echoed through the empty halls, each sound lingering far longer than it should. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, abandoned buildings had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Around midnight, I found myself in the second floor hallway, scrubbing the floor near the old surgery room. The faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights was my only company, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't loud, more like soft, deliberate taps, coming from the far end of the hallway. I froze, gripping the mop handle tightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard and moved toward the sound, my curiosity outweighing my better judgment. The laminated card flashed in my mind. Rule number 2. If you hear someone calling your name, do not respond. But no one had called my name, right? I wasn't breaking the rule. As I reached the end of the hallway, I found nothing. Just an empty corridor leading to the surgery room. The footsteps must have been some kind of echo, I told myself. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. Still, my hands were clammy, and my chest felt tight. Shrugging it off, I turned back to my cart and continued cleaning. That's when the lights in the surgery room flickered. My head snapped toward the door, which was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. The dim light inside pulsed irregularly, casting long shadows across the hallway. I hesitated. The card's first rule popped into my head. Never enter the surgery room after 10 p.m. But I wasn't planning to go in, just to peek inside. I moved closer, the mop still in my hand, as if that would protect me from whatever was inside. Through the crack in the door, I saw the gurney in the center of the room, just as I had the night before. But this time, something was different. A shadow? No, a shape. Shifted behind it, just out of sight. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, knocking over a mop bucket. The crash echoed through the hallway, and the light in the surgery room went out. I grabbed my cart and bolted back to the janitor's closet, my heart pounding. I locked the door behind me, sinking to the floor. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, but I knew one thing. The rules weren't a joke. The third night began with dread hanging over me like a storm cloud. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow in the surgery room or the memory of those footsteps. My instincts told me not to go back, to find another job and never look at that place again. But I needed the money, and the thought of walking away felt like admitting defeat. When I arrived, Grayson was waiting for me by the security desk. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried weight. "Any issues last night?" he asked. For a moment, I thought about telling him everything. The footsteps, the shadow, the lights. But something stopped me. The way he looked at me. It was like he already knew. "Nothing I couldn't handle," I lied, forcing a smile. He didn't press further, just handed me the keys and the same laminated card, like a grim reminder. By the time midnight rolled around, I had settled into a cautious routine. I cleaned each room methodically, always keeping an eye on the shadows and my ears tuned for any unusual sounds. The rules were no longer a strange set of guidelines. They were lifelines. Then I made a mistake. It was almost 11 p.m. when I noticed a faint, buzzing sound coming from the second floor. It was subtle at first, like a fly trapped in a jar, but it grew louder as I approached the source. The door to the surgery room was ajar again, and the flickering light was back, casting a pale glow into the hallway. My gut screamed at me to turn away, but curiosity overpowered caution. The laminated card burned in my pocket as I pushed the door open just a little, to see inside. The gurney was still there, but something was draped across it, something large and unmoving. My stomach churned as I realized it was a shape that resembled a person, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its arms stretching unnaturally long, almost touching the floor. Its head tilted slightly, as if it sensed me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The buzzing grew louder, reverberating in my skull, and the air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. Slowly, the figure moved. Not like a person, but like a puppet being jerked on invisible strings. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, and I saw its head turn toward me, though it had no face, no eyes, just smooth, featureless skin. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. As my foot hit the hallway floor, the lights in the surgery room went out completely. The buzzing stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the janitor's closet. Locking the door behind me, I collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving. The rules weren't just arbitrary instructions, they were the only thing keeping me alive. That night, I stayed locked in the closet until my shift ended. When I finally stepped outside, the cool morning air hit me like a blessing. But the relief didn't last. I knew I couldn't keep breaking the rules, not if I wanted to survive. By the time I clocked in for my fourth shift, I was exhausted. The events of the previous night played over and over in my head, each detail more vivid and horrifying than the last. I'd spent the entire day convincing myself that I was imagining things, that the shadow in the surgery room and the faceless figure on the gurney were just tricks of my overworked mind. But deep down, I knew better. The hospital greeted me with its usual oppressive silence. Every step I took seemed louder, every shadow darker. My hands instinctively brushed against the laminated card in my pocket, as though touching it could somehow shield me from the building's horrors. I moved through the first few hours of my shift mechanically, cleaning the floors and dusting the long-abandoned equipment. Around 2:30 a.m., the air began to change. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, like a low, droning vibration that pressed against my skull. I checked my watch. The dreaded hour was approaching. 3 a.m. The rule was simple. Make sure all the lights on the second floor are off. But as I stood at the base of the staircase, staring up into the pitch-black hallway above, my legs felt like lead. Reluctantly, I climbed the stairs, gripping the railing tightly. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing through the empty corridors. The second floor was worse than usual. The air felt heavy, as if the darkness itself had substance. My flashlight flickered as I approached the first switch panel. I reached out and flipped the switch. The lights went out with an audible click, plunging the hallway into total darkness. My breathing was shallow, and my fingers trembled as I moved to the next panel. I couldn't stop thinking about the rules, about what might happen if I failed to follow them. Halfway down the hall, I heard it. A voice. My name, called softly from somewhere in the shadows. Tom. The sound was faint, almost pleading, like someone in pain. I froze. Rule 2. If you hear someone calling your name, do not respond. My throat tightened as the voice called out again, louder this time. Tom, help me. It sounded like my sister. I hadn't seen her in years, but I would have recognized that voice anywhere. My heart ached at the thought of ignoring her, but every instinct screamed at me to stay silent. I gritted my teeth and kept moving, focusing on the next light switch. The voice followed me, growing more desperate with each step. At exactly 2:59 a.m., I reached the final switch. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight, but I managed to flip the lights off just as the clock hit 3 a.m. The voice stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I stood there in the darkness, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of my eye. It was subtle, just a flicker, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I reached the janitor's closet, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I didn't leave the closet until sunrise, clutching the laminated card like it was a talisman. The rules were no longer just guidelines. They were survival tools. And I was beginning to understand that breaking even one of them could cost me my life. When I walked into St. Mary's for my 5th shift, I knew something had changed. The air inside the hospital felt different, heavier, colder, and charged with an unnatural tension. I gripped the keys in my pocket, my fingers brushing against the laminated card as I moved down the main hallway. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but the thought of skipping a shift felt almost as dangerous as staying. The night started uneventfully. I kept my head down, following the rules with a religious fervor. By now, the laminated card felt more like scripture than a set of guidelines. Every time I flipped a switch, cleaned a corner, or entered a room, I ran through the rules in my head like a mantra. At 11:45 p.m., I noticed something unusual. The door to room 313, which was always locked, was ajar. My stomach churned. Rule 4. Do not, under any circumstances, look directly into the mirrors in room 313. I had no intention of going anywhere near that room, but the open door felt like a dare, a challenge from the hospital itself. I grabbed my mop and forced myself to move past the doorway without looking inside. The shadows in the room seemed to ripple, almost inviting me to peek. I clenched my teeth and kept walking, focusing on the task ahead. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't meant for me. Around 1:30 a.m., I made my way to the east wing to clean the floor near the old patient rooms. That's when I heard it, a soft creak, like someone stepping on an old wooden board. I froze, my grip tightening on the mop handle. Another creak followed, closer this time. My flashlight wavered as I scanned the hallway, but nothing moved. That's when I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, which I knew I had locked earlier, was wide open. My heart sank. Rule 5. If you hear knocking, ignore it. But there had been no knocking, just a door swinging open on its own. I debated what to do. Should I lock it again and risk breaking another rule, or leave it and hope whatever had opened it didn't come looking for me? Before I could decide, I felt it. A shift in the air, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. Then, from behind me, came the sound I had been dreading all night. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, its shape distorted and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth. like it was gliding instead of walking. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing through the other rules. None of them mentioned what to do if one of these things found you. I retreated to the janitor's closet, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My breathing was ragged, and my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for the movement outside. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the knocking. Slow, steady, deliberate. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The laminated card dug into my palm as I gripped it tightly. My lifeline in the darkness. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The knocking eventually stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't dare move until the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the cracks in the closet door. Only then did I unlock the door and step out, my legs trembling. The hallway was empty, but the door to room 313 was fully open now, the mirror inside reflecting something that wasn't there. I turned away quickly and made my way to the exit. I didn't look back. By the time my shift ended, I was no longer sure if I could keep doing this job. My hands trembled as I locked the front door of St. Mary's behind me and stepped into the dim, early morning light. The cold air felt sharp against my skin, but it was a relief to be out of that suffocating building. Still, the events of the night clung to me like a shadow. The footsteps, the knocking, the figure. It was as if the hospital itself was trying to wear me down, testing my resolve. When I got home, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faceless figure gliding down the hallway or the open door to room 313, its mirror reflecting something impossible. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the laminated card in front of me. The rules had saved me so far, but for how much longer? I felt like I was running out of time. The next evening, Grayson was waiting for me when I arrived. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with that unreadable expression of his. Finally, he handed me a fresh card, identical to the one I'd been carrying. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm managing," I said, my voice unsteady. Grayson nodded slowly. "Good. Just remember, the rules are there for a reason. They've been tested, refined. Stick to them, and you'll be fine." His words offered little comfort. If the rules were so effective, why did it feel like the hospital was pushing harder every night? I wanted to ask him, but something in his expression told me I wouldn't like the answer. The night started quietly, almost too quietly. I moved through the first few tasks on autopilot, my mind preoccupied with the figure I'd seen the night before. It didn't make sense. None of this did. Why would a hospital have such specific, bizarre rules? What was this place hiding? Around midnight, I made my way to the janitor's closet to restock my supplies. That's when I noticed it. Tucked behind a stack of old boxes was a file folder, yellowed with age. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it out, flipping through the brittle pages. The documents were incomplete, but they painted a grim picture. Experimental procedures, unapproved treatments, and vague references to containment protocols. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't just a hospital. It had been something else, something darker. As I read, the air around me seemed to grow colder. A faint buzzing sound filled my ears, and I realized too late that I had lingered too long. The laminated card slipped from my fingers as the lights in the closet flickered and went out. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam barely penetrated the thick darkness. From somewhere behind me came a sound. A faint, wet scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but the narrow space was empty. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the closet door. I froze, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The rules raced through my mind, but none of them prepared me for this. The door rattled once, then fell silent. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, waiting for the next sound. But instead of an attack, a voice came. "Tom." It was Grayson. But his voice was wrong. Too calm, too smooth. My blood turned to ice as the door creaked open. and for a split second, I saw something standing there. It wasn't Grayson. It wasn't even human. Its head tilted unnaturally, and his featureless face seemed to leer at me, even without eyes. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I bolted past it, running blindly down the hallways until I reached the front doors. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the pale glow of the streetlights. The laminated card was still in my pocket, but now it felt like a useless relic. The rules might have saved me tonight, but it was clear they weren't foolproof. As I stumbled away from the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't done with that place. Not yet. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me as I walked, and for the first time, I wondered if the hospital wasn't just haunted by something, but if it had become something. The thought made my skin crawl. I wasn't sure I could go back for another shift, but a gnawing dread told me I wouldn't have a choice.